Pop quiz. What is the most threatened group of vertebrates on the planet? With 2 in every 5 species threatened with extinction worldwide, amphibians have earned this unfortunate title. If you have an affinity for vulnerable species, like me, this is probably secondhand knowledge to you. However, did you also know that of the 3 major amphibian groups, salamanders are the most imperiled, with about 60% of species facing extinction? Welcome to Two-Way Conservation, an endangered species podcast where I sit down with professionals in the field of conservation biology to discuss the species that interest us the most and the work being done to secure a better future for those species. I'm your host and budding conservationist, Tyrus Takis. On today's episode, I'm joined by Dr. Mizuki Takahashi, an associate professor of biology and animal behavior at Bucknell University in Pennsylvania. Aside from his teaching duties, Dr. Takahashi runs the university's amphibian research lab, where he and his team study the ecology, behavior, and of course, conservation of amphibians. So, without further delay, let's strike up a little conservation conversation. Dr. Takahashi, welcome to Two-Way Conservation. It's a pleasure to meet you. Could you tell us a little more about yourself and how your career ties into the world of conservation biology?
Hey, good morning. Thanks for having me. So again, my name is Mizuki Takahashi, Associate Professor of Biology at Bucknell University. I was born and grew up in Japan. I did my undergrad and master's in forestry in Japan. And then I decided to come to America to study conservation of amphibians when I was 27. Since then, I did master's at Marshall University, West Virginia, and then University of Memphis in Tennessee, PhD. And then I got a job at Bucknell. That was 2008 as a postdoc. And then I did a visiting assistant professor and finally tenure track. And now again, I am associate professor here.
Oh, you've had quite the academic journey. That's excellent. Now, I did initially become aware of your research and your team through the Bucknell Laboratory website. But for our audience, could you just give us a little more insight as to the specific species that you work with and maybe some of the current research that you're doing?
So our lab has 2 main research themes. One is based on the local species, which include mostly wood frog, spotted salamander, and eastern hellbender. So for wood frog and spotted salamander, we've been studying how they interact with each other because wood frog tadpoles, they love eating spotted salamander wild egg masses, embryos, which creates all kinds of interesting interaction because normally salamanders are carnivores and they tend to eat small insects and small creatures, and tadpoles are omnivores in general, but they can be predaceous and eat other amphibian eggs, including spotted salamanders. So we've been looking at that, and also we are interested in effect of pollution on the species interaction between the 2 species I just talked about. So that's one. And then for eastern hellbender, we are mostly using environmental DNA to monitor and detect new populations. And also we try to fine-tune the way to use eDNA in understanding, let's say, life history of the species or optimize the best sampling method for eDNA. So that's one theme. The other one is about giant salamanders in Japan. So I take students to Japan over the summer. We do research on this fascinating giant dinosaur-looking species. Yeah, so mostly for giant salamander, we focus on parental care, male-male competition based on the injury records and habitat fragmentation and basic monitoring of populations because we don't have enough people to do so in Japan.
And are all of the species that you mentioned native to the northeastern region of the country? Obviously, I assume that the Japanese giant salamander is not.
Right. It's an endemic species to western Japan, and they live in mountain streams where water tends to be cold and oxygen-rich water is available. So that's a native species to Japan. And as I said, I'm from Japan, so I really enjoy the tie between here and then going back to the country and doing some conservation work. try to contribute to the conservation of my own country's species.
Mm-hmm. You had also mentioned the wood frog and the spotted salamander. Those are, I assume, native to the mainly northeast. Okay, excellent. So I also heard that you mentioned hellbenders, which is exciting. I've actually done a bit of research on that species for my current program. You're actually partially to thank for that, so thank you. I am aware that the Ozark hellbender subspecies is federally endangered, and that the federal protections for the eastern hellbender subspecies are more or less still pending across its full range. Are the other species that you mentioned on the endangered species list?
Yeah, so wood frog and spotted salamanders, those are common species. So there is no listing in Endangered Species Act. But the Japanese giant salamander is listed under Japan's Ministry of Environment Red List. And also IUCN, International Union for Conservation of Nature, list the giant salamander as vulnerable, which is one of the species that are threatened with extinction.
Right. And how would you say that your research is helping threatened species recover from the brink, if you will?
That's a great question. That's a very difficult question. So I wanted to be a conservation biologist to clearly promote conservation of the species and potentially protect not only the species, but ecosystem. But I found it very difficult. Scientists have limited power to influence the actual conservation of the species because we need to change policy to grant the protection for those species. And scientists, that's not our background. We do research and we provide the data for policymakers to use to make the best decision. But often we don't really involve in the process of translating scientific data to policy. I try talking to people when I'm invited to whatever the conferences or local organizations. I try to educate people about the species. But through my sort of main channel as a scientist, I sort of question my contribution to the conservation. There is no way for us to directly influence policy.
I understand that the way that scientists go about their work, it's very limited on the power they have to influence policy. Is there a lot of room for the general public to get involved in conservation efforts?
Yes, I think it's very important and foundational for the general public to be involved in the conservation work. First, the general public needs to know where we are in terms of losing species. We are facing the sixth mass extinction because the rate of species loss is much greater than it should be. And scientists warn that if we continue driving extinction of the species, we're going to reach another mass extinction, which means we had 5 of those in the past, and then this is going to be the 6th one. And the definition of mass extinction is loss of 75% or more species over 2 million years. And based on the simulation, we're going to lose more than 75% very quickly, much less than 2 million years. So that's a sort of global scale of what is happening. And it's important for, again, the general public to know that. And also what are the direct causes of the 6th mass extinction. And then based on the knowledge, it's important to act locally because it's impossible to change global system, but we can contribute to local conservation organizations or making donations to conservation groups. And those are the things the general public should be doing, hopefully.
I do agree. In your professional opinion, assuming that we are able to save some of these species from the brink of extinction, how do we make the switch from saving the species to actually coexisting with them in ways that could benefit the local economy and the animal itself?
So, because human has spread to every corner of the globe, the only way to save species is to coexist with species. There is no places on Earth that doesn't have human influence. Climate change affect everywhere on Earth. That's one example. Pollutions and all that things too. So we need to coexist with the species, and that's foundational. In terms of economy, there are some examples or conservation tools of promoting both economy and conservation, such as ecotourism. People bring tourists to the area, and instead of exploiting resources within the natural park or within the given natural resources, they benefit from tourism. and then use the money, of course, to sustain their lives, but also to promote the conservation of the area. And I believe there are some successful stories in Africa and other areas, but it's not always possible. There are some species that are not really attractive to tourists. And hellbenders, I love hellbenders. You love hellbenders. If you love hellbenders, you want to go to see them. But hellbenders are not appealing to everyone. And there are so many other species that play very important roles in ecosystem. However, they don't become good flagship species for ecotourism. So I think we need to shift our view from economy to something greater than that, which is sort of foundational appreciation for what we have. And I'm sure people enjoying the springtime, you're looking at the trees and flowers, and they make us happy, right? We have co-evolved with nature, and we have that innate joy of being connected to the nature, which should be cultivated when people are young. But unfortunately, this connection between us and nature has become greater and greater. And a lot of people sort of do not perceive the joy coming out of nature. So again, economy is important, but I think we need to get back to what we started.
I definitely agree. And for the Japanese giant salamander in particular, I know Japan is a major tourist attraction nowadays, especially among my generation. I would love to talk more about the Japanese giant salamander. I do find that animal very fascinating. I've read that they've gained federal protection in Japan as a special natural monument.
Yep.
Has this helped reduce the population loss or helped raise public awareness of the vulnerability of the species?
Yeah, good point. So, as I said, Japanese giant salamander is listed under Ministry of Environment Red List. That's one listing. The other one is that you just talked about, the Special Natural Monument designated by the Agency of Cultural Affairs. So that's a legal protection given to the species. And actually, that's the highest legal protection given to any wildlife in Japan. Not coming from Ministry of Environment, but coming from Cultural Affairs Agency. Actually, so enlisting species in the Ministry of the Environment Red List does not grant any legal protection, nothing. They just list species and they don't really do anything about the species, which is very frustrating to me. However, designation as a special natural monument, again, gives highest protection. So without a permit, no one can touch them. No one can, of course, raise them. No one can move them. It's a strict protection, and I am sure that law helped the species. However, although the law also says that we need to protect the habitat, but that becomes a little less specific, because what do you mean by habitat? Like having a river might be habitat. If that's the definition, people can change the riverbank from natural to concrete, or making dams, and still river is river. So by our standard, our means ecologist, habitat protection has not been done by the law, which is the major reason why the species is listed under red list, both by the international organization and then domestic organization.
So, since you did mention the issue of damming, I have completed several projects that involve the effects of dam-induced habitat fragmentation on hellbender species in particular. This term, however, I have been focusing more on invasive species. Now, I've heard of invasive species impacting native species through predation or outcompeting native species for shared resources. But in terms of the Japanese giant salamander, I've never heard of invasive species negatively affecting native species through hybridization before. Could you speak a little more on that?
Yeah, so another urgent conservation challenge for the Japanese giant salamander is hybridization between introduced Chinese giant salamanders and the native Japanese giant salamanders. So in the past, it was legal to import Chinese giant salamanders until Japan joined CITES, which is an international treaty that regulates trading of endangered species. I think Japan joined CITES in 1980. So until then, it was legal to import Chinese giant salamanders, and there are records suggesting we imported a lot of Chinese giant salamanders, and some of them got loose and released into the streams, and unexpectedly, because those are two different species and you wouldn't think they can hybridize, but they were hybridizing, and the hybrids are spreading in some areas, being sort of removed and controlled under humans in other areas. But overall, that has become one of the major issues in Japan now.
So, growing up in Japan, was the Japanese giant salamander a significant part of your professional journey? And what would you say was the ultimate decision that led you to study in the United States? Was it another particular species?
Right. So to answer the first question, I need to show you the picture book that my parents gave me when I was sixth or seventh grade. No, it's not sixth, seven. I think I was second or third grade. So this is the book.
Would you mind describing it since it's an audio format?
This is one of the series, the first science book for children.
Very cool.
Clearly, this is about the Japanese giant salamander. And I guess my parents knew I would love the book. Although we don't have the species in Tokyo, I grew up in Tokyo and we don't really have this species. It's outside of the distribution range. So I never saw them until I became adult. But they bought me this book, and it's a lovely book based on a lot of scientific data. Just briefly showing the picture, painting is awesome. It's very realistic. And I think this book has a lot of conservation issues, and they have a developmental stage. It's an awesome book. It's out of print, so you can buy it. And I cherish this book. I brought this from my home to America to show this to my students, because this is how my passion for giant salamanders started.
The illustrations are beautiful. It's also definitely the type of book I would give to my own children. I present them with a lot of scientific literature for children. Was there a species of interest that did ultimately lead you to study in the United States?
Yeah. When I went to the graduate school in Japan, mastering forestry, I was not quite sure about what I wanted to do with my career. And then I sort of toyed around a few options, and one of them was to become a researcher. And eventually I chose that route, but I wanted to switch from forestry to conservation biology, especially focusing on amphibians, because that's when chytrid fungus has become a huge issue. And people still did not know what was going on. And that sort of caught my attention. And just like you said before our conversations, amphibians are most threatened group of vertebrates. And that got me interested in the species. But going back to the conservation biology, when I was a grad student, we did not have conservation biology in Japan. The first textbook in Japanese about the conservation biology was published in 1996. And I was the first year graduate student. And then another book was published in the following year. And I read those textbooks in Japanese, and that got me so excited. And I knew this is my passion. But again, because Japan was behind, there are no labs focusing on conservation biology at that time. That made me decide to come to America and study the conservation biology.
Now, you had mentioned that you bring students to Japan to study the Japanese giant salamander. I imagine that's a major selling point for recruiting the students to your lab. Is it every summer that you take that expedition to Japan?
Yes, every summer since the COVID, I've been taking 2 or 3 students to Japan and stay there between 1 and 2 months. Not only doing research, but I give them enough time to do sightseeing and stuff. I mean, could be once in the lifetime experience for them. And you're right, students know I do that. So students reach out to me and ask me, can I join your lab? It's a great deal because I find funding to bring students, so students don't have to pay anything. They get paid for the summer stipend through biology research fellowship. And I'm going to be with them 24/7. I do driving, transportation, I translate, I guide through research project. We do morning meditation together every morning, so that's another benefit. But it's been great, and I feel grateful that I can merge my background as a Japanese into biology curriculum at the university.
Now, you had mentioned COVID. Has that put the trips on pause, or are you still making the regular journey?
Yeah. So I couldn't take students to Japan during the COVID. And even after the COVID, I think the first trip was 2022. And American people don't need to have visa to come to Japan to stay up to 3 months. But in 2022, Japanese government was still restricting people coming to the country. So I had to go through this additional visa application and working with the government security and all that. So I remember it was a lot of work. And at some point, we didn't think this would happen. But yeah, we made it happen. And since then, so 22, 23, 24, 25, and then this year I'm taking 3 students to Japan.
So, as a student in the combined environmental sciences and policy and the GIS program at my university, I did want to tailor some of my questions toward the policy side of conservation as well as the GIS side. So, from your perspective, what are the hurdles in getting research data to actually trigger a formal change in the species' legal protection status? The reason I ask is with hellbenders in mind, who I mentioned are proposed members of federal endangerment listing since the end of 2024.
To be honest, none of my research triggered policy change so far. So, but I foresee that media plays really important role. And if someone found my research to be valuable in changing policy, and if they run some news articles or just like you interviewing me, that might trigger policy change. But the Enlisting Endangered Species Act of 1973 in this country is much more realistic route that scientists can take, because I know the group of scientists who propose enlisting of eastern hellbenders include some of the professors, and they work with federal and state government to collect the data and then submit the proposal. So it's much straightforward way to make that policy change. And the great thing about Endangered Species Act is that once the species is listed, government is responsible for delisting the species by investing resource and research and money. So automatically that grants promotion of conservation of the species. But like I said, unfortunately in Japan, we don't have that system.
So shifting gears a bit, you had mentioned environmental DNA techniques that you used to detect species of interest. Has this strategy proven effective for your team's research in detecting the presence of these rare hellbender species or other species? And what would you say some of the major advantages or disadvantages of using this technique are?
Yeah, I've been very pleased by the eDNA technique, especially working with undergraduate students, mostly at Bucknell, and teaching a lot of courses more than large universities. It's hard to have the time to do field surveys, research. For eDNA, we can minimize time in the field, bringing water samples or doing filtration on site, and then bringing the filter papers. And we can preserve the filter papers in -80 freezer or in ethanol. And then whenever students have time, they can go through eDNA extraction and running qPCR. So it's much more flexible method to do detection of species. Instead of going out to the field every day, wading in the river, try to catch salamanders. I mean, that would be, I would love that. I like doing that, but given time constraints and students' availability, eDNA works much better for us. And then, of course, the detection probability is higher when you use eDNA as opposed to spending a lot of hours in the stream and looking for hellbenders. So it's been a great technique.
I have also read of some of the disadvantages, such as an increase in potential false positives or even negatives by using this technique. Is that something that's of concern for you in your lab?
There is a risk of a false positive and negative, no matter how we follow the protocol and make sure no contamination and all that. But we do run negative controls, multiple samples, not only the field negative control, but also PCR negative control. And then we run 4 replicates per 1 sample. And if there is 1 positive and 3 negatives, we think that's a negative. So we try to sort of adjust the probability of false, negative, and positive as much as we can. But as you mentioned, that's a real sort of hindrance in interpreting eDNA data.
Now, as a partial GIS student myself, does your lab rely on any other modern techniques for detecting these elusive species, such as remote sensing or the use of GIS applications?
We don't. I love to do telemetry maybe and using GIS and delineating habitat range and seasonal movement. But again, that would require a lot of time in the field, which I don't have. And undergrad students that don't, and many of them don't have cars in my lab. And of course, that takes a lot of training too. So it's a very difficult thing for primary undergrad institutions to do.
So, as you may have guessed by some of the questions I asked, I believe it's important to keep the public involved in matters of biodiversity conservation. I'm sure that you, as an educator, would agree. What are some of the ways that you and your team help raise public awareness on conservation issues you face in your lab?
So in America, sometimes I get invited to give a talk at local organization or conservation organization, different universities. And again, I emphasize the importance of conservation of biodiversity. That's as much as we can do here in America. But in Japan, I take students to rural Japan and stay there for about a month and do research, and locals become really interested in what we are doing. And for them, seeing giant salamanders in the stream is nothing because they grew up with the species. And some of them don't like them because they think they eat the fish that they want to catch. And some of them are afraid of them because they can bite you sometimes. But bringing students all the way from America to Japan make them sort of reevaluate the value of the species that they have. So I found that students talking to the locals, and they actually give presentations for the local residents, actually change their perception of the species and promote conservation.
That's actually outstanding. Now, I've taken a look at your laboratory website and I've noticed that you have written a book, if that's correct. Now, my wife and I are big fans of Japanese anime and manga, and the cover of this book kind of gives manga vibes. I was
Yeah.
wondering, does this book serve as a conservation storybook or more of a standard textbook or maybe a hybrid of the two?
Well, I wrote the book for young Japanese people, like junior high school students, and college students to be more interested in conservation of species and to educate them about the sixth mass extinction. So it has a lot of scientific facts, so can serve as a textbook. In fact, I developed a new course called Mass Extinctions based on the book I wrote in Japanese. So it is an educational book that contains a lot of scientific facts.
Could you remind me of the name of that textbook, please?
Yeah. So is the sixth mass extinction, or is the mass extinction going to happen again? That's the English sort of translation I can translate.
Now, on the website, you had mentioned covering topics like the importance of grassroots conservation organizations in the book. Could you elaborate further on this? Perhaps give an idea of what else we might learn by reading the book?
Yeah. So I think the grassroots conservation organizations are so important, especially in Japan when government doesn't lead initiatives in conserving species. Like I said, they list species under red list or as a special natural monument, but they don't really do anything to conserve them. So naturally, conservation actions have to come from citizens. And, individually, we can really function as a powerful movement. So naturally, again, grassroots organizations are so important in conserving biodiversity in Japan. In fact, I grew up in Machida City, Tokyo, and there was a really nice piece of forest next to my apartment. And I used to go to the forest all the time after school. And that's where I became so passionate about nature. I caught a lot of creatures. I started catching beetles. I used to love beetles. I still love beetles. And I started catching like fish and frogs and aquatic insects. And I just enjoyed the little piece of forest available to us. But most of the forest is now gone because of the development. But I learned that small grassroots local organization stood against the development, negotiated with the company and then also local government, and they were able to preserve, I would say, maybe 5% of that original forest. And I am respectful and appreciative of their conservation efforts. And because I got to know their history and what they have done, I joined the group now. And every summer when I go home to Japan, I join the group and I do nature walk with the local elementary school kids or counting wildflowers and doing some maintenance in the trail. So it's essential, especially in Japan.
Excellent. I would agree. Now, do you eventually have any plans on translating your book to English or any other language just to help broaden awareness of some of the concepts discussed?
I think there are so many great books in English available. I feel I don't have to really translate. I was inspired by a lot of English books. But like I said, I developed a course based on my book. Mm-hmm. So at least my students, some of them are getting a piece of what I wrote in the book.
So we're coming close to the end of our interview. I did want to ask one last question of you. Do you have any advice for rising conservationists who are looking to pursue a career in academia or field ecology or even policymaking or GIS?
Oh, that's a really tough question. And, we talked about this, Tyrus, before we started the interview. This is a challenging time for young people to pursue conservation as a career. I think you have to ask yourself, you have a true passion for the conservation career. Otherwise, it's hard to sustain yourself because a lot of challenges. So when students come to me and ask me like, hey, I want to go to PhD grad school in conservation biology, like, can you help me? I normally say you shouldn't, because reality is it's hard to get a job. And I know that because I've been through the process, and getting a job as a tenure track professor is not easy. But those students who possess genuine passion for conservation, they come back and they tell me like, hey, I know it's hard, but I really want to go. And those students, I try my best to support, guiding their research or writing letters of recommendations, introducing some of their colleagues in the field. So I want more young people to be interested in conservation biology, but unfortunately, there is no really trick to get a job or changing the society to pay appropriate appreciation for those jobs at this moment. And I think your passion is your guide. You have to ask yourself, do you really have that passion? Otherwise, it's going to be a challenging pathway. As you know, grad students are poor. Then you got to finish your research and you never know how long it's going to take, or can you complete? And even after that, can you get a job? But I enjoy the process though. I think that's another important thing. Like, you enjoy every step of your career as someone who pursue conservation career. And eventually that leads to the next step.
I think that's very sound advice. Thank you. Well, Dr. Takahashi, thank you again for joining us on Two-Way Conservation. This has been very informative, and I certainly look forward to staying up to date with some of the amazing work you and your team are doing.
Thank you again for having me.
You just heard my conversation with Dr. Mizuki Takahashi, Associate Professor of Biology and Animal Behavior at Bucknell University. If you're interested in learning more about the research and conservation efforts that Dr. Takahashi and his team are engaged in, please feel free to visit his website at sites.google.com/bucknell.edu/Takahashi-lab. There, you will also find a link to Dr. Takahashi's book. Thank you again for listening to this episode of Two-Way Conservation, an endangered species podcast. I'm your host, Tyrus Takis, reminding you to protect the species by empowering the conversation.